Welcome back, everyone. I shall be speaking to you for the next 15 minutes with this rather pretentious title that you see here. Like my predecessors on this platform, I am greatly honoured and indeed thankful to be invited to this occasion. But I have an extra reason to be thankful, which is that I am put in a position where I'm not the first lawyer to speak. That is always an unenviable position because, as you are probably aware, lawyers are not always the most welcome guest at the feast. We have this reputation for mercenary pessimism. If there is one thing more galling than paying money to be told what you cannot do, it is paying money to be told what you should not have done. And this is, unfortunately, a role that falls to us all too often. I'm going to talk today very briefly about quite a narrow but nevertheless highly remunerative corner of the creative industry, and that is the creation, composition and management of international art exhibitions. And I have here some figures which recently emerged from England about the sort of revenue which this can bring in to a city or a country which has successfully adopted a global art lending and art borrowing capability. And you will see here, for example, the Tate Modern had 700,000 visitors in the first half of the present year, up from 425,000 in 2013. Even 2 years ago, UK national museums attracted 50 million visitors. And the income generated by this in various forms and manifestations runs at between 3 and 4 million pounds, possibly even more. So there is, accordingly, considerable incentive in not only developing an international loans program, but also, and this is my theme today, in making sure that the underpinning, the sinews of that loan program are effective and work and protect the art that you are lending or borrowing from legal misadventure. It is one thing to be earning billions of pounds. It is another thing to be moving art worth billions of pounds around the world every year. This happens. But it is a third and much less rosy, attractive thing to find that art worth millions, if not billions of pounds, entangled in legal disputes. And these arise all too often in the international art lending market. Many of them can be avoided by appropriate legal initiatives. Just as the creation of art exhibitions is an art form in itself, so the provision of good legal machinery, good legal infrastructure is essential to ensure that revenue isn't turned into catastrophe, as does happen, and I'll give you some examples later on. I agree with Chris Smith when he said earlier on that a lot of creative expression does not require a great deal of government money. Good legislation does not require a great deal of public money, but it is nevertheless essential to the ways, to the success of this international art lending market. Now, I mention these things partly because our own country has a very successful record, but partly also because we and other English-speaking countries have witnessed a number of misfortunes over the last few years, which any country seeking to enter this market more deeply than it occupies at the moment would do well to consider. And I have to say that, in my view, part of the know-how of this sort of enterprise is something which more countries that are more advanced in this field could usefully lend to and share with the neighbours who are at a different stage of development. We are meant to have, as you probably know now, a European loan circuit, whereby all the members of the European community share their art and learn from one another. Indeed, this art is meant to contribute to the flowering of the European culture, whatever that may be. I think it would be a responsible thing if experienced nations shared their expertise and technical know-how with nations who are less experienced at this form of cultural exchange. There are two ways in which it happens. The first is that there should be statutory incentives. The laws of particular countries should enable and facilitate this. It need not cost a lot of money. As I say, the TFEU, it should be, the Treaty for the Function of the European Union, actually encourages nations to lend art. And we have a number of acts of Parliament in England which facilitate and incentivize that form of cultural activity. We have, most recently, the Burrell Art Collection in Glasgow had been liberated from the former prohibition on lending or borrowing anything by a statute which simply says now you can lend anything from the Burrell Collection and it can borrow anything to go into the collection to be exhibited alongside it. Both of these were things that were not allowed under the original will of the donor, Sir William Burrell. More importantly, we have what is called an anti-seizure statute, a statute which guarantees to anybody lending to an exhibition in England, whether it's a private collector, foreign museum, or even a nation, that there will be no legal interference, there will be no court order, judgment, or ruling preventing the return of that work of art to the lender or the lending institution when the loan is over. This is contained in the statute here, which I have to say was enacted very hurriedly when there were threats by Professor Piotrowski of the Hermitage not to lend to the Fauve exhibition at the end of 2007. There had been difficulties in Switzerland with Russian art collections, and he said, unless we're guaranteed this stuff is going to come back, particularly Matisse pictures, then we're not going to lend it at all. So Parliament, as it can do on occasions, acted quickly and expeditiously, and it brought in this legislation. We should not only, I think, plough our own furrow, I think we should learn from one another. Australia last year enacted what I think can only be called a state-of-the-art immunity from seizure legislation. The Australians looked at all the other statutes in the world, about 14, which guaranteed loaned art from seizure, promised that it would come back, and they developed a statute which I have to say is further advanced and more comprehensive than the English legislation or than any other. The Australians built on the experience of others. So cultural exchange is complemented by technological exchange and cross-fertilization. I said we could act quickly in this country. We acted very quickly when we wanted to send back the original copy of the Australian Constitution. I say send back. It had never been in Australia before, but it went to Australia on loan, and Parliament passed what is possibly the shortest statute on record, saying that this beautiful vellum document, the original Constitution of Australia, shall cease to be included in the records of the Public Record Office. People saw this as an extremely English way of doing things. It didn't say, we give it to you. It didn't even say it shall be deleted from the records. It said it shall cease to be included in the records. How does something cease to be included in the records? I don't know. You delete it. But we didn't say that. And we were also very careful to say this is only the Australian Constitution. British Parliament, well, certain members of the UK Parliament might have been tempted to jump up and make an amendment and say, and could certain other objects be added as well? Large stone objects, for example, or something like that. So they drafted the statute very narrowly. It's important to remember when you send something abroad, and an international loan, that you're sending it not only into a potentially hostile physical environment. Curators worry a lot about temperature control and conservation and all that sort of thing, damage in transit, damage in situ, terrorism, but you're also sending it into a potentially terrifying legal environment. You do not know what is going to happen legally to the object in the country of destination, the borrowing country, unless either you conduct scrupulous research or you get the borrowing country to conduct scrupulous research and guarantee to you that it has, or you have an immunity statute. When we sent the Cyrus cylinder to Iran, we were given assurances. Apparently we were given governmental and judicial assurances, so how judges can assure you what they're going to do, I don't know, that this thing would not be seized and that it would come back, as indeed it did. The French agreement with the Emirates, the government of the United Emirate Republic, specifically says that the borrowing institutions, the country of borrowing, will take the necessary measures at national level to guarantee the unseizability of the object. So here the government and the borrowing country actually said, don't worry, we will ensure that measures are in place to ensure that this object does come back. It's an interesting thing. Is a government promising what its parliament will do? Can a government promise that its parliament will pass a statute? Some governments probably can. Others perhaps might be more modest about predicting which way parliament will go. I think if there's one reason why in England, in the United Kingdom, we have learned to be very careful about sending art around the world, and indeed borrowing it from around the world, it is the emergence of claims, information and controversies relating to the Holocaust. A vast quantity of art and other portable valuables was seized during the Holocaust, and it is only in the last 20 years, really, that details of this have begun to emerge, and claimants, descendants of murdered families, persecuted families, and so on, are beginning to come forward. No country wants to be seen to be profiting from evil. If you borrow an object and it is found to have been of Holocaust origin, the question will be asked, well, why didn't you find out beforehand? How has this come about? And then, of course, you are faced with the dilemma, as the borrowing institution, whose will do you follow? There might be a collector who's lent it to you who will say, right, I want it back. At the first hint of trouble, it must come back. But the claimant, the descendants of the murdered Jewish family, will say, yes, but it was ours. We want it back. One of the bad things about borrowing art, and of course it's mainly a very beneficial enterprise, is that you can find yourself in this nutcracker situation, the pincer mechanism. You have two people on your back, the lender and the third-party claimant, the murdered family or whatever. And one has to be extremely careful about that, which is why not only do we bring in anti-seizure legislation, but we also insist that before the legislation comes into operation, the most scrupulous provenance inquiry is made. So, the Treaty of Lisbon says, lend as much as possible. This suggests create as much immunity as possible, but we have counter policies, of course, and the counter policies are we should be transparent, we should not handle stolen art, we should not profit from evil. Now, all these are experiences, one might say bitter experiences, which we have suffered in England and from which we have learned. I suspect that not every country in the world has the same depth of experience as us, and I suspect that many of these countries could profit from that experience. There was a meeting of legal experts in Salzburg a few years ago where they recognized that if you are to have a European policy of circulation, maximal circulation of works of art, you've really got to clear them. There are many museums that have got things that they not only wouldn't lend, they wouldn't even show in public because they're not too happy about where they came from, or they're not sure where they came from. And so the resolution, one of the resolutions of this global forum, was that if you have unresolved repatriation and restitution disputes relating to any work of art, it inhibits circulation, it inhibits conformity with the Lisbon Treaty, and these difficulties, these unresolved differences, controversies, need to be resolved. It's not necessarily rocket science to resolve them. It's not necessarily impossible. It can be done by goodwill and the use of intelligent dispute resolution mechanisms. But it is important to do it. And again, I do urge people here from countries that perhaps don't have the same volume of art lending and borrowing as us to learn from those experiences. It should not be difficult to do so. So, in a way, art lending is creative at three levels. It involves very creative things. It involves the further creativity of creating, composing the exhibition, putting it together, the concept. But then there's the further creativity, and I suppose it's the minor key, it's the boring lawyers, the less charismatic aspect of actually making it work, making sure that art travels honestly and reputably, and making sure that it comes home. So, national governments can help in this respect by devising appropriate legislation. I could give you many more examples. But we also need greater skill in transacting. much of the safety of a travelling work of art depends on the quality and content of the contract under which it travels. People talk about loans. That's a misnomer, actually. These things aren't loans, technically. They are contracts, contracts for the bailment of a work of art, if you want to be technical about it. A lot can go wrong. A lot can become derailed, irrespective of whether there is favourable legislation or not, if parties have not drafted the contract in the way which best maximises the advantage to be got from the loan. And you need to be smart, because you might be dealing with people who are smart and who will try to inflict on you contracts which are disadvantageous should certain circumstances eventuate. What you need in this field is not only to be informed, but to be capable of that sort of constructive pessimism which most of us instinctively avoid. In other words, think about what could go wrong. There is, of course, the great excitement of getting the exhibition together. There is this feeling that nobody wants to be negative, but believe me, negative things do happen. Look at this list of museums. These are museums, with the exception of one in Germany, in England, in Canada and Australia alone, which have been sued or have been involved in legal action in the last couple of decades. There are more, but I ran out of space. So you see, it's not a trouble-free activity. It's not some amicable exchange conducted in the village atmosphere of art curators who know and trust one another. It's, you could say it's a war out there, and you've got to be careful to avoid this sort of thing. This is a charabanc of lawyers arriving to earn their enormous fees in these cases. And this, of course, is the old thing about if you go to law, you've got two peasants fighting over a cow, and the lawyer is milking it in the middle. But that is a gross misrepresentation. In real life, you'd have at least two lawyers milking the cow, and not one. And I'm sure you know this. So look at things which have gone wrong. In 2004, we loaned, on perfectly legitimate circumstances. This was not a thing stolen. It was loaned to the Melbourne Museums, Museum Victoria, and it belonged to the British Museum, was given by Aboriginal people to a colonial administrator who gave it to the British Museum. But once it arrived in Australia, somebody, a member of the Wurundjeri tribe peoples, invoked an obscure statute to say that this had to be seized. It could not be publicly displayed. Why? Because it was illegal to desecrate an Aboriginal artifact. Well, you would think, what's desecratory about putting it in a museum? The answer was, in a further subsection, desecration was defined as any use not in accordance with Aboriginal tradition. And that was how this thing came to be seized, and that was how it came to be involved in legal proceedings, which eventually led to its return. But it led to a lot of angst. There was even, I think, possibly at least the risk of dissension between the English lender and the Australian borrower. There are many others. There's recently been a report about a Holocaust-related object in the Tate, and one of the arguments of the Tate was, one of the arguments of the claimants was, look, you lent this round the world. Surely you checked it out, checked out its provenance before you lent it to other institutions. The Tate said, no, 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 we rely on the lender, the borrower, to check the provenance. And you see here, the report of the spoliation panel says, well, this is rather surprising. Here you are sending something in which public money has been invested around the world, exposing it to the risk of claims, and not even checking out the provenance of it, whether you own it, and whether it's been taken from murdered people, as indeed it had. So there isn't just the risk of financial loss, there's also the risk, the huge risk of reputational loss and embarrassment. Perhaps the most striking recent example of an institution incurring or should we say, reputational misfortune, wasn't a borrowing, wasn't a loan, it was an acquisition of this Shiva Nataraja by the National Gallery of Australia. It turned out that it was looted, it was amputated from an Indian temple, and it had to go back. 5.4 million Australian dollars were spent on this thing. This apparently was a discoverable flaw in the title. The legal advice that they received didn't warn them that the Australian legislation whereby the government inspectors could seize looted art was retrospective. So it didn't only apply to things looted after the legislation came into force. The whole thing was a complete mess. And now the institution, the museum, is suing the vendor, Mr. Subhash Kapoor, to get their money back. But he is in India under arrest, his assets are frozen, and some people say it's little more than a face-saving exercise, possibly even throwing good money after bad. We had an incident in England in 1999 where the Royal Holloway College wanted to sell a constable, and they used a different dealer to sell it from the dealer that they'd used to sell a Gainsborough some time earlier. And that dealer then came forward after the constable painting was sold and said, no, the deal was, I get the commission anyway if it's bought by someone whom I introduced. And the thing went to court. It went all the way to the Court of Appeal. The Royal Holloway College lost, and they had to pay him his commission. On top of the commission, they paid the dealer they engaged. They had to pay his costs, and they had to pay their own costs. And the journalists called for the resignation of the chairman of the Council of Royal Holloway and Bedford College. What really happened was that they did not keep records. Here you are entering into a multi-million-pound transaction for the disposal of, and it was controversial enough in itself that it was being disposed of, and it had been the gift of Samuel Courtauld, disposing of an object worth, again, millions of pounds, and they didn't have proper contracts, they didn't have proper records of conversations, there was no audit trail by which they could defend themselves in court. Now, this is simply down to institutions and the way they transact. And there is a need for greater transactional efficiency. But since we have been hardened in the fire in this country, there is, I think, I say this country, the United Kingdom, there is a lot, I think, that we can teach other people, and we would be very happy to do that. If you don't have anti-seizure legislation, I think Greece doesn't, you miss out on things. This Monet in 1904 was diverted on the way home from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It didn't go on exhibition in London. It went straight back to Caen, the museum at Caen in northern France, where it belonged, because we didn't have anti-seizure legislation. Even last year, Taipei refused to lend things to us because they thought our anti-seizure legislation, which we do have now, wasn't good enough. They weren't convinced that it was secure enough. They thought it was a blanket with holes, and they, at the last minute, declined to send it to us. Humiliatingly, perhaps, shortly afterwards, they did loan material. This is the National Palace Museum. They did loan material to Japan, which had recently adopted its own anti-seizure legislation, because it thought the Japanese statute was all right and ours wasn't. This is rather sad, really. So it ill becomes me, therefore, to preach to you about the superiority of our own legal system when we too have our misfortunes. If you're wise, you will learn from these. I've said nothing about intellectual property because it's been touched on before, and I'm out of time. But there is a potential for debacle and misfortune when I think people fail to appreciate the relationship between the physical object and the intellectual property in that object. They are distinct things. They aren't always interbound, interrelated. Sometimes they can be disposed of separately. We did have this misfortune in England. The National Lottery Fund acquired the Churchill papers and omitted to acquire the copyright in them, which meant that the family continued. People saw this at the time as typical of the major government and good intentions, but didn't quite realize themselves. This was difficult, not only because, of course, if you are acquiring an object, you want the ability to reproduce it. The family could inhibit, could embargo quotation from it, because the copyright still belonged to them. And scholars, particularly a Churchill biographer called John Cholmondeley, complained that the family were using this accidental retention of copyright to actually control what was being said and what was being quoted from the papers. We do very recently have litigation which has dealt with that problem. There is much more I could say about this, but I'm going to stop now. You can ask me if, contrary to expectation, you want to know more. But bear in mind that however good your legal system, you have to constantly review it, you have to constantly update it, because, as the Museums Association Code in England says, it is your duty to keep abreast of developments in the law. And, as the great man himself said, success is never final. Okay? Thank you.